October 23, 1942. Dawn broke over the Egyptian desert near El Alamein. Inside the cramped hulls of their Carro Armato M13/40 tanks, crews of the Ariete Armored Division checked their ammunition one final time. 104 rounds of 47mm shells per tank. 4 breeder machine guns loaded and ready. Behind them, the sound of diesel engines rumbling as 278 Italian medium tanks prepared for what would become the largest armoured battle in North African history. These Italian tankers had no idea that within hours they would witness something that would shatter every assumption they held about their equipment and their chances. The Americans had arrived with a tank that would make the M13/40, Italy's pride and most produced armoured vehicle, look obsolete. What followed was not just a military defeat, but a revelation that would transform thousands of Italian soldiers from believers in fascist propaganda into witnesses of American industrial might. This is the story of how Italian tank crews discovered, through fire and steel, that they were fighting a war with equipment hopelessly outmatched. A transformation so complete that it would change not just individual soldiers, but the fate of an entire nation. The seeds of this revelation were planted years before, in the design rooms of Fiat Ansaldo in 1937. The Italian Royal Army had issued specifications for a new medium tank to replace the aging L3 tankettes and the flawed M11/39. The result was the Carro Armato M13/40, named for its scheduled weight of 13 tons and its projected introduction year of 1940. On paper, the M13/40 seemed formidable. It mounted a 47mm Bardia gun in a fully rotating turret, a significant improvement over its predecessor, which had a hull-mounted gun. The armour ranged from 30mm on the frontal hull to 42mm on the turret front. 4 crew members operated the tank: a driver, machine gunner/radio operator, commander/gunner, and loader. The diesel engine, a Fiat 5.8 producing 125 horsepower, gave it a top speed of 32 km per hour and excellent range. Production began in late 1940 at Ansaldo Fossati factories, with Fiat supplying engines and Bardia delivering weapons. By December 1940, monthly production reached 60 to 70 tanks. Over 700 units of the M13/40 would roll off the assembly lines before production shifted to the improved M14/41 variant. In total, over 3,000 tanks would be built on this chassis or its derivatives, providing the bulk of Italian armoured forces throughout the war. Italian tank commanders initially believed the M13/40 represented their entrance into modern armoured warfare. The 47mm gun could penetrate British cruiser tanks at normal ranges. The armour protected against British 2-pounder guns. They felt ready to fight, but these tankers were about to learn a harsh lesson. Modern war was not static. It was a race, and Italy had already fallen behind before the first shot was fired. The first M13/40 tanks arrived in North Africa in late 1940, equipping the Babini Brigade. These crews received approximately 25 days of tank training before deployment, a fraction of what British or German crews received. Most units were hastily formed, lacking cohesion and experience. Many tanks initially lacked radios, forcing commanders to communicate through hand signals or by dismounting, a critical tactical disadvantage. The baptism of fire came in December 1940 during Operation Compass, a British offensive. At the Battle of Bardia from January 3 to 5, 1941, Australian forces attacked Italian positions defended by M13/40 tanks. In 3 days of fighting, the Australians suffered 456 casualties. The Italians lost 40,000 men, including 2,000 killed, 3,000 wounded, and 36,000 captured. Italian tankers who survived Bardia reported the confusion. Most vehicles had no radios. When British artillery opened fire, tanks could not coordinate responses. Tanks were destroyed before they could even engage the enemy. Those that did fire found their shells effective against British light tanks, but the crews were too few, too scattered, too unprepared. The problem was not entirely the tank itself. In early 1941, The M13/40's main gun could penetrate most British cruiser tanks at normal combat ranges. Its armour was comparable to opponents like the British Crusader. The design was conventional but adequate for its time. The true weakness lay in training, doctrine, and support. Italian tank crews lacked proper instruction in combined arms tactics. Recovery vehicles were virtually non-existent, meaning disabled tanks were often abandoned. Maintenance in the harsh desert environment overwhelmed undertrained mechanics. Supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles of African coastline. By April 1941, when the German Afrika Chorus arrived in force, the Italians fielded approximately 240 M13 and M14 tanks in first-line service. These crews had learned hard lessons from the early defeats. Training improved. New tank training centres opened in Italy. Crews became more proficient. Radios became standard equipment. Italian tankers learned to work with German units. They could fight. And fight they did. At the First Battle of Bir el Gubi on November 19, 1941, Italian M13/40 tanks from the Ariete Division engaged British armour in a day-long battle. The engagement demonstrated that improved Italian crews could hold their own against British Crusader tanks armed with 2-pounder 40mm guns. Both tanks were vulnerable to each other's weapons. Both had weaknesses and strengths. The battle raged across the desert as columns of smoke rose from burning vehicles. By late afternoon, British forces withdrew, leaving behind 42 to 52 destroyed Crusaders, according to various estimates. The Italians lost 34 tanks. It was a tactical victory that showed Italian tankers had come far from the confusion of Bardia. They had learned their machines. They understood fire and manoeuvre. Given proper training and support, they could match their opponents. During the Gazala battles in May and June 1942, Italian armour continued to prove effective in certain circumstances. On June 12, 1942, M13/40 tanks from the Trieste Motorised Division engaged British Grant tanks in the fighting south of Knightsbridge. Multiple Allied tanks were destroyed in the engagement. Italian crews used speed and positioning to their advantage. They closed distance and fired at tracks and sides. It was desperate work, but it proved Italian tankers could fight. Yet even as Italian crews became more skilled, the technological gap widened. In early 1942, the British began deploying the American-built M3 Grant medium tank in significant numbers. The Grant mounted a 75mm gun in a hull sponson and a 37mm gun in the turret. Though the hull gun could only traverse 15 degrees, it outranged the Italian 47mm weapon and could penetrate Italian armour at distances where Italian shells were ineffective. The M13/40's weaknesses became more apparent with each passing month. The riveted construction meant that when shells struck the armour, even without penetrating, the rivets could become deadly projectiles inside the crew compartment. The bolted hull plates had a tendency to crack under stress. The two-man turret forced the commander to act as both gunner and tactical leader, slowing reaction times. The engine, though reliable, was underpowered for the tank's weight, especially when crews added sandbags or spare track links for extra protection. Tank crews recognized these problems. Many attempted to improve their vehicle's protection by piling sandbags on the glacis plate or welding additional track links to vulnerable areas. But these modifications made the already slow tanks even slower and increased breakdowns from overtaxed engines and transmissions. Italian commanders discouraged the practice, but desperate crews continued it anyway. The Italian army recognized the firepower problem. Beginning in 1942, each tank battalion included at least one company equipped with semoventi 75/18 self-propelled guns. These turretless vehicles mounted a 75mm howitzer on the M13/40 chassis and could fire-shaped charge high-explosive anti-tank shells capable of penetrating Allied armour. They provided crucial fire support that helped offset the medium tank's weaknesses. But the semoventis were not tanks. They could not engage in mobile tank combat like the M13/40s. And there were never enough of them. Then came October 1942 and the Second Battle of El Alamein. Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery's British Eighth Army had spent months building up for a massive offensive. 3 armoured divisions, including the famed Desert Rats, prepared to smash through Axis lines. The British assembled 1,000 tanks for the battle, including new Crusader Mark III tanks with powerful 6-pounder guns and Churchill infantry tanks with heavy armour. And they brought something else. Something Italian tankers had heard rumours about but never seen. American M4 Sherman medium tanks, 250. 2 Shermans were operational at the start of the offensive, equipping multiple British armoured brigades. This was the Sherman's combat debut in North Africa. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Panzer Army Africa, which included German and Italian forces, deployed approximately 540 tanks to defend. Of these, 278 were Italian M13/40 and M14/41 variants. Another 20 were Italian L6/40 light tanks. The Italian armour formed more than half of the Axis tank force. Italian tank crews took position in the southern sector of the 40-mile El Alamein line. Around them, other Italian tanks dug in behind the extensive minefields Rommel had laid. 450,000 mines, twisted with barbed wire and covered by anti-tank guns, formed the Devil's Gardens that were supposed to slow the British advance. On the night of October 23rd, the Allied artillery opened fire. 900 guns hurled shells across the desert in a bombardment that shook the earth. The barrage lasted for hours, a tempest of high explosive and shrapnel designed to destroy, demoralize, and confuse. When the guns fell silent just before dawn, the infantry assault began. British and Commonwealth troops advanced through the minefields, engineers clearing paths for the armour to follow. On the second day, the tanks came. Italian crews saw them through their commanders' periscopes as the sun climbed above the horizon, shapes in the distance, moving through the dust and smoke. Too many to count. Commanders called out ranges and targets as they had practiced countless times. The main guns swiveled, tracking the approaching armour. Then they got their first clear look at a Sherman. It was larger than expected, taller. The hull seemed to slope at angles that would deflect shells. Even at over a kilometre away, crews could see the long barrel of the 75mm gun, much larger than their own weapon. The Sherman moved with what seemed like casual confidence, not the desperate rushing of tanks under fire, but the measured advance of a predator that knew its prey was outmatched. The M4 Sherman medium tank represented everything the M13/40 was not. Where the Italian tank weighed 14 tons, the Sherman weighed 31 tons. The Italian tank had 30 to 42 millimeters of armour. The Sherman had 51 to 64 millimeters of frontal hull armour, heavily sloped for better deflection, and 76 millimeters on the turret front. The Italian main gun could penetrate 88 millimeters of armour at 100 meters using Spanish Civil War-era test data, though this dropped significantly against sloped armour. Against the Sherman's sloped frontal armour, Italian shells had little chance of penetration, except at point-blank range. The crews could only hope to penetrate a Sherman from the sides or rear, or by hitting the tracks and suspension. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun, in contrast, could penetrate 88 millimeters of vertical armour at 100 meters and 73 millimeters at 1,000 meters. Against the M13/40's thin, unsloped, riveted armour, these shells were devastating. The Sherman could destroy an Italian medium tank from the front at any combat range. Worse still, the Sherman was faster, more reliable, and easier to maintain. Its Continental radial engine produced 400 horsepower, more than 3 times the Italian tank's output, giving it superior acceleration and cross-country performance. The 5-man crew was properly distributed, with a dedicated commander freed from gunnery duties. Communication systems were excellent. The suspension handled rough terrain better. Ammunition storage was better protected. In every measurable category, except perhaps fuel consumption, the Sherman was superior. The first engagements with Sherman tanks lasted only minutes for most Italian crews. Tanks in hull-down positions hoping to ambush Allied armor as it advanced, discovered the Shermans would not oblige. The American and British crews halted at 1,500 meters, well outside effective range for the Italian guns, and began firing. They had excellent optics and training. They took their time, picking targets methodically. Sherman rounds penetrated Italian turret fronts and hulls. Tanks exploded as ammunition detonated. Others caught fire. When shells struck without fully penetrating, the riveted construction proved deadly. Rivets sheared off and became shrapnel inside crew compartments, killing and wounding men even when armor held. Italian crews ordered their drivers to reverse, to get behind better cover, but the Shermans used their superior range, armor, and mobility to dictate the terms of engagement. This pattern repeated across the battlefield. Italian crews fought with desperate courage, trying to close range where their guns might be effective. But the Shermans stayed at distance, used hull-down positions, coordinated with infantry and artillery. When Italian tanks did manage to close range, often through clever use of terrain or nighttime maneuvers, they discovered another problem. Even successful hits on Sherman frontal armor often failed to penetrate. The sloped armor and face-hardened plates deflected shells that would have destroyed an M13/40. Italian tankers were reduced to aiming for tracks, trying to immobilize their opponents, hoping that infantry anti-tank guns or German tanks could finish what they started. Every engagement became about survival, not combat. Crews learned to run, to hide, to pray that they would not face the Shermans directly. The Second Battle of El Alamein raged for 13 days from October 23rd to November 11th. Montgomery's forces broke through the Axis lines in the north, forcing a general retreat. The Ariete and Littorio armored divisions fought desperate rearguard actions, sacrificing themselves to cover the withdrawal of German forces. Tank after tank was left burning in the desert as Italian armor died to buy time. By November 11th, when the battle ended, the Axis forces had been decisively defeated. The Eighth Army lost approximately 500 tanks during the battle, but most were repairable. The Axis lost virtually their entire armored force. Of the 278 Italian medium tanks that began the battle, fewer than 30 escaped the battlefield. Many were simply abandoned when they broke down during the retreat, left as scrap metal in the desert. The retreat from Egypt marked the beginning of the end for Italian armor in North Africa. As the front lines moved westward, Italian tankers faced not only Shermans but also more British Grants, improved Crusaders with 6-pounder guns, and growing numbers of American forces equipped with the latest armor. By early 1943, the situation had become desperate. The Centauro division, fighting in Tunisia, was virtually destroyed. The remaining M13 and M14 tanks were completely surpassed technologically. Their main guns were useless against Allied medium tanks except at point-blank range, while those same Allied tanks could destroy Italian armor from a distance. Italian crews resorted to desperate tactics. They targeted tank tracks and suspensions rather than attempting to penetrate armor. They relied heavily on supporting semovente self-propelled guns and towed artillery. They attacked at night when possible, trying to close range under cover of darkness. They used terrain masterfully, ambushing from unexpected positions. But tactics could only compensate so much for material inferiority. The end came in May 1943. General Jürgen von Arnim surrendered the remaining Axis forces in Tunisia. Approximately 250,000 German and Italian soldiers became prisoners. Among them were the survivors of Italy's armoured units, tankers who had fought from the earliest days in Libya through the catastrophic defeats in Egypt and Tunisia. These men entered Allied captivity with a mixture of relief and shame, relief that the fighting was over, that they had survived. Shame that Italy had been so thoroughly defeated, that their tanks had proven so inadequate, that all their sacrifices had accomplished nothing. But captivity would bring its own revelations, ones that would prove even more psychologically devastating than the battlefield defeats. They would see industrial capacity that made their battlefield losses not just understandable, but inevitable. Several thousand Italian prisoners were shipped to the United States. The voyage across the Atlantic in the summer of 1943 took 2 weeks aboard American Liberty ships. These vessels themselves were monuments to American industrial power. The famous SS Robert E. Peary had been launched after just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes of construction at Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California, in November 1942, though additional fitting out extended total delivery time. Normal construction averaged 30 to 42 days by 1943. These ships, produced at a rate approaching 3 per day at peak across multiple shipyards, were returning from delivering supplies to the European theatre. The Italian prisoners noticed the abundance immediately. American sailors ate meals that included fresh meat, vegetables, white bread, and milk. The waste shocked the Italians. Sailors threw away half-eaten food, leftover bread, excess portions. Things that would have been treasured in Italy were discarded without thought because the supply seemed endless. The American crew ate better than Italian officers. They complained about the food quality while eating steaks and fresh fruit. They threw away in one day what Italian families would consider a month's ration. When the ships approached the American coast and docked at Norfolk, Virginia in August 1943, the prisoners received their first view of American industrial infrastructure. The naval base sprawled across thousands of acres, dozens of ships loaded and unloaded simultaneously. Electric cranes lifted cargo that would have required gangs of laborers in Italy. The port operated 24 hours, ablaze with electric lights even at night. Former factory workers from Italian industrial cities counted dozens of cargo ships in various stages of loading. They noted in letters home that each crane moved more material in an hour than Italian dock workers could handle in a day. Everything ran on electricity. Everything was mechanized. Everything was efficient on a scale that seemed impossible. The prisoners were loaded onto trains for transport inland, not boxcars but passenger coaches with padded seats. The journey from Norfolk to prison camps in the American interior would take several days, passing through Virginia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, and into Texas and Oklahoma. Along the way, Italian prisoners pressed their faces against windows, witnessing an America that contradicted everything fascist propaganda had told them. Every small town blazed with electric lights. Shops had illuminated windows displaying goods. Houses had lights in multiple rooms. Factories ran night shifts, their parking lots full of workers' automobiles, hundreds of them, thousands of them. In Italy, private car ownership was a privilege of the wealthy. Here, ordinary workers drove to their jobs. Italian officers who had travelled through Germany noted in letters that passed Allied censors that they had travelled through dozens of American towns and cities. Everyone had more electric lighting than Rome. They passed factories larger than anything in Milan or Turin. At midnight, they saw parking lots full of cars belonging to workers on the Pormus night shift. Workers owned cars. In America, workers owned cars. The trains passed near industrial facilities that demonstrated American manufacturing capacity. Near Louisville, the prisoners glimpsed the Rubbertown synthetic rubber complex. Multiple massive factories, each employing thousands, formed part of a national program that produced over 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually by 1945. Louisville's facilities alone contributed nearly 200,000 tons at peak production. Italy and Germany combined could not match the total American output. Near Detroit, the trains slowed as they passed Ford's Willow Run bomber plant. This single factory, built in just 9 months, produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes at peak production in 1944. At its height, 42,000 workers assembled bombers from over 1.5 million parts manufactured by 1,500 subcontractors. The plant was visible for miles, a structure so large it seemed impossible. Italian prisoners who had served in the Regia Aeronautica recognized what they were seeing. That one factory produced more aircraft in a month than all of Italy produced in a year. They had flown missions over British positions and wondered where all the planes came from. Now they knew. And the British planes were nothing compared to American production. The prison camps themselves provided the next level of revelation. Camp Hereford in Texas, one of several facilities housing Italian prisoners, held approximately 5,000 men in wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heat. The camp hospital had X-ray machines, surgical equipment, and pharmaceutical supplies superior to most civilian hospitals in Italy. The daily food ration included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread in quantities Italian civilians had not seen since before the war. Prisoners assigned to kitchen duty discovered walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, and gas ranges that could prepare meals for thousands. The 10% surplus food, prepared to ensure everyone received full rations, was discarded daily. Fresh bread, perfectly good vegetables, excess meat, all thrown away because American regulations required abundance. Former Italian chefs assigned to camp kitchens wrote in anguish to their families. They threw away more food each day than their entire villages had seen in months. Not spoiled food. Fresh bread. Good vegetables. Meat without defects. The Americans required excess to guarantee no one went hungry. They had so much that waste was policy, not failure. By autumn 1943, the labor shortage in American agriculture led to Italian prisoners working in fields and factories under Geneva Convention rules. They could not work directly on war production, but they could labor in industries that freed American workers for military service. This meant Italian tankers, men who had fought American forces in the desert, now witnessed American productive capacity firsthand. At farms in Nebraska, Italian prisoners worked in wheat fields that stretched to the horizon. A single combine harvester did the work of 100 men using traditional methods. Yields reached 60 bushels per acre, double what Italian farms achieved on their best land. The farmers spoke casually of production that would have been fantasy in Italy. At cotton processing facilities in Texas, former tankers watched single electric-powered gins process more cotton in 1 hour than their entire home regions could handle in a month using traditional labor. The facilities were part of rural electrification programs that were rapidly expanding across America, transforming agricultural productivity. Prisoners noted that the farmers who owned these facilities were not aristocracy, not wealthy elite, just farmers. Yet they had electricity, running water, trucks, cars, and tractors. At a Campbell Soup factory in New Jersey, Italian prisoners watched automated production lines process more tomatoes in a single day than most Italian canning facilities handled in a month. One elderly woman monitored controls that managed what would have required 50 workers in Italy. She did this while listening to a radio and drinking coffee on break. The factory operated with a skeleton crew because most young workers were in military service, yet production exceeded peacetime levels. Italian tankers working at military supply depots helped unload equipment and gained insight into American logistics. They saw warehouses full of spare parts for tanks, trucks, and aircraft. They watched trains arrive daily with artillery shells, machine gun ammunition, and replacement engines. The abundance was staggering. They had wondered in Africa why the Americans and British never seemed to run short of supplies. Now they understood. The Americans did not have supply lines. They had supply rivers, supply oceans. They produced so much that shortage was impossible. The transformation of Italian prisoners accelerated through late 1943 and into 1944. The cumulative evidence, the daily observations, the irrefutable facts of American industrial supremacy broke down the propaganda they had been fed for years. They had been told that democracies were weak, that Italy's fascist system was more efficient, that American society was in decline. Everything they saw proved the opposite. Italian officers attended educational courses offered at the camps. American universities provided correspondence programs. Professors lectured on democracy, economics, and constitutional government. The lectures were not propaganda in the crude sense. They were reasoned arguments backed by observable reality. Officers wrote to their families that they had been told democracies could not match Axis production because they valued profit over national service. Yet American factories, run by private companies, produced more tanks than all Axis nations combined. They had been told worker exploitation was necessary for military strength. Yet American workers, paid good wages and allowed to organize unions, built better weapons faster than Italian workers under strict control. Every assumption they had been taught had been proven false by what they saw with their own eyes. The Battle of Normandy in June 1944 brought news that 6,000 Allied ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 150,000 men in the first wave had landed in France. Italian prisoners at camps across America watched newsreels of the invasion within days. They saw the endless streams of ships, the artificial harbours, the supply system that delivered 15,000 tons of material daily across open beaches. Officers watching the newsreels turned to their fellow prisoners and admitted what had become obvious. Italy had challenged this industrial power with Fiat trucks and M13 tanks that broke down in the desert. They had been mad. They had been criminally, stupidly mad to think they could win. Throughout their captivity, Italian prisoners experienced something unexpected: American humanity. Despite propaganda depicting Americans as ruthless and vengeful, prisoners discovered a people who separated the Italian soldiers from the fascist regime. American guards explained that they were fighting Mussolini and Hitler, not the Italian or German people. When prisoners received Red Cross messages about family deaths in Allied bombing raids, American camp commanders personally delivered the news and offered condolences. When prisoners' families fell ill in Italy, American church groups helped send medicine through neutral channels. These small acts of kindness, repeated thousands of times across dozens of camps, challenged the prisoners' understanding of their enemies. The medical treatment particularly affected Italian tankers who had been wounded before capture. Tank injuries were often severe: burns and shrapnel wounds and crushing trauma. American military hospitals provided care that exceeded what German or Italian facilities offered. Penicillin, the miracle drug, was used freely even on prisoners. Italian medical officers who worked in camp hospitals later testified that they used advanced medicine without hesitation on enemy prisoners. Soldiers who would have died from infected wounds in Italian hospitals recovered because Americans gave them penicillin. After Italy's armistice with the Allies on September 8, 1943, approximately 90% of Italian prisoners, around 45,000 men, agreed to cooperate with the Allied war effort. These men were organized into Italian service units, given better quarters, American uniforms with issue insignia, increased freedoms, and opportunities to interact with Italian-American communities. They worked in ports, supply depots, and support roles, freeing American soldiers for combat. The remaining 10% who maintained fascist allegiance were separated into facilities like Camp Hereford, where they received standard POW treatment under Geneva Convention rules. As the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Italian prisoners faced repatriation with mixed emotions. Many had been in America for 2 years. They had eaten better as prisoners than as soldiers. They had been treated with dignity by enemies who had defeated them. They had witnessed a society that worked, that produced abundance, that proved democracy could function. The last months of captivity were spent preparing for return. American authorities provided vocational training, agricultural education, and political instruction about democratic governance. Prisoners learned about economic systems, constitutional rights, and civic participation. They were being prepared not to return as defeated soldiers, but as potential citizens of a new democratic Italy. Between 1945 and 1947, tens of thousands of Italian prisoners returned to Italy. The country they found was destroyed. Cities bombed. Infrastructure ruined. Economy collapsed. The fascist government that had sent them to war was gone, replaced by fragile democratic institutions. But these returning prisoners brought something valuable: knowledge of how a democratic industrial society functioned. They had seen efficiency without tyranny. They had witnessed prosperity without conquest. They had learned that strength came from freedom, not control. The Italian economic miracle of the 1950s and 1960s was built partly on knowledge gained in American prison camps and on American Marshall Plan aid. Former prisoners brought American methods to Italian industry. They implemented agricultural techniques learned on American farms. They supported democratic institutions because they had seen democracy work. Historians who have studied the Italian prisoner of war experience in America note several remarkable statistics. Of the tens of thousands of Italian prisoners held in the United States, fewer than 1% attempted escape. Post-war surveys showed that 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Thousands maintained correspondence with American families for decades after the war. Many immigrated to America in the 1950s and 1960s. The technical specifications tell part of the story. The M13/40 weighed 14 tons with 30 to 42 millimeters of armor and a 47 millimeter gun. The Sherman weighed 31 tons with 51 to 64 millimeters of frontal hull armor, heavily sloped, and 76 millimeters on the turret front. The Sherman's engine produced 400 horsepower compared to the M13's 125. Both guns could penetrate approximately 73 to 88 millimeters of vertical armor at 1,000 meters, but the Sherman's sloped armor made it effectively much thicker. But the deeper story is about systems, not just machines. Italy produced approximately 3,000 tanks on the M13/40 chassis and its variants during the entire war. America produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks between 1942 and 1946. American industry built tanks faster than they could be destroyed. Italian industry could not replace losses. The M13/40 required skilled craftsmen to build. Production rates rarely exceeded 70 tanks per month. The Sherman was designed for mass production from the start. At peak production, American factories delivered over 2,000 Shermans per month. One factory alone produced more tanks than Italy's entire annual output. This production capacity was replicated across every category of military equipment: aircraft, trucks, artillery, ammunition, all produced in quantities that Italy could not match. The Italian tankers who fought Shermans at El Alamein were not defeated by better soldiers or superior tactics, though both played roles. They were defeated by an economic system that could sustain total war on a global scale. Historians who studied Italian armor in World War II have concluded that the M13/40 was not a terrible tank by 1940 standards. It was adequate for its time. The problem was that by 1942 it was obsolete, and Italy lacked the industrial capacity to design, produce, and field a successor in meaningful numbers. Italian tankers fought courageously with increasingly obsolete equipment against enemies with superior material. Their defeat was inevitable not because of cowardice or incompetence, but because of mathematics. The story of Italian tankers facing Sherman tanks is ultimately a story about industrial capacity determining military outcomes. No amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome a 3-to-1 disadvantage in numbers, combined with a technological gap that made each individual Sherman superior to each individual M13/40 in nearly every measurable way. But it is also a story about transformation. The Italian prisoners who witnessed American industrial might did not just learn that they had been outmatched, they learned why. They saw an economic and political system that produced abundance through freedom rather than scarcity through control. They returned to Italy as advocates for democracy, helping build a nation that would become one of America's closest allies. Second Lieutenant Luigi Arbib Pascucci of the Ariete Division exemplified the courage of Italian tankers even in the face of impossible odds. On November 4th to 5th, 1942, at the Second Battle of El Alamein, Pascucci commanded 11 M13/40 tanks in a final counterattack against the British 8th Armored Brigade. His action allowed the Ariete Division to retreat, though Pascucci himself was killed in the fighting. He was posthumously awarded Italy's highest military honor, the Medaglia d'Oro al Valor Militare. Today, the Italian Army's 13th Tank Battalion bears his name, M.O. Pascucci, honoring his sacrifice. General Francesco Antonio Arena commanded the Ariete Division during its final battle at El Alamein. On November 4th, 1942, as his division was surrounded and destroyed, Arena sent a famous last message that captured both the desperate situation and the determination of Italian armor. Enemy tanks broke through south of Ariete Division. Thus, Ariete surrounded, located 5 kilometers northwest of Bir el Gubi. Ariete tanks are fighting. The division earned its Gold Medal of Military Valor for conduct in multiple engagements at Tobruk, Bir el Gubi, Gazala, Alam el Halfa, and El Alamein. British and New Zealand accounts acknowledged the effectiveness of Italian armoured units when properly equipped and led. The Ariete Division, despite obsolete equipment and initial training deficiencies, proved capable of determined resistance. British historian John Latimer assessed that Italian soldiers were tough and hardy, and on innumerable occasions they fought as bravely as any soldiers in the world. The Folgore Paratrooper Division sent 5,000 men to El Alamein with only 304 surviving, fighting to their last ammunition. The transformation was complete. Italian tankers had gone to war believing in fascist strength. They encountered Sherman tanks and discovered their equipment was hopelessly outmatched. They became prisoners and witnessed the industrial system that made their defeat inevitable. They returned home as advocates for the democratic capitalism that had beaten them, helping build a new Italy allied with the nation that had crushed their tanks in the desert. In the end, America's victory over Italian armour was not just military, it was ideological, economic, and complete. The M13/40 crews who fought at El Alamein left the battlefield defeated. But those who experienced American captivity left transformed, carrying back to Italy seeds of democracy that would help create the prosperous, free nation that exists today. The rumble of diesel engines in the Egyptian desert that October morning in 1942 marked not just the beginning of a battle, but the beginning of a transformation. Italian tankers climbed into their M13/40 tanks as fascist soldiers. They emerged from the war as witnesses to a better system, one that would shape Italy's future for generations. They had been stunned by Sherman tanks on the battlefield, but ultimately they were converted by what those Shermans represented. The overwhelming productive capacity of free people, working in free markets, building a free society, that was the true weapon that defeated Italian armour. And that was the lesson that rebuilt Italy after fascism fell. The story stands as testament to a profound truth. Military technology reflects economic systems. The Sherman tank was superior to the M13/40, not because Americans were inherently better engineers, though American design was excellent. It was superior because American democracy created conditions where innovation flourished, where mass production thrived, where abundance was possible. Italian tankers learned this lesson in the hardest way imaginable. Through defeat, through captivity, through witnessing the success of their enemy's system, but they learned it thoroughly. And in learning it, they helped transform Italy from a fascist dictatorship into a democratic republic, allied with the very nation whose tanks had destroyed theirs in the North African desert. The M13/40 now sits in museums as a relic of a failed system. The Sherman, though also retired, is remembered as a symbol of democratic industrial might. But the real legacy is not in the tanks themselves. It is in the men who fought in them, who survived, who learned, who changed, and who built a better future from the ashes of defeat.